Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today I'm going to talk to you all about the Cold War in the 1950s. The Cold War was a long and rapidly changing period of time, taking up an entire era of world history. If you want to know more about why it happened, check out my video on that. For this video, talking about the major events of the Cold War in the 50s, it revolves around three main topics. The development of massive weaponry, which actually, instead of encouraging a world war, as did the first one, this would actually make people deterred from starting another world war. Secondly, the beginning of proxy wars, ways for countries to fight each other without using their massive weapons directly against each other. And thirdly, the beginning of decolonization. The Cold War in the 1950s was a truly global event, with the United States and their NATO allies in Europe for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization trying to contain Soviet oppression from breaking out across the world. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, with their European subjugated people in Warsaw Pact, were trying to break out and spread their influence across the globe. This brings us to our first main theme of the Cold War in the 1950s, the avoidance of a major world war. This is pretty strange because it's a global confrontation between two different military powers, and they don't fight it out. This is largely because of the development of weapons of mass destruction. After World War II, the United States had developed nuclear bombs, which could destroy entire cities with one aircraft. 4 years later, the Soviet Union would use spies to steal this technology, and they would gain it as well. And if this wasn't bad enough, throughout the 50s, both sides would develop H-bombs, or hydrogen bombs, which had explosive power tens and even sometimes hundreds of times greater than even the atomic bombs used on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Having a war with these weapons would be unbelievable. And on top of this, they developed weapons such as stealth submarines and ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they could strike each other with these weapons with almost no warning if they decided to do so. This had a profound impact on American culture, as it led people to have great fears of what could happen in the event of nuclear war and under a possible communist takeover. One famous expression of this paranoia is the duck and cover cartoons that were shown to school children to train them on what they should do in the event of a nuclear attack. This is hard for us to understand now because we've lived with the existence of nuclear weapons our entire lives. But for these people, where nuclear weapons had just been designed, they had every reason to believe that in the coming years, they would someday be annihilated in nuclear war. This fear was not helped at all by the Red Scare, which is the McCarthy trials led by Senator McCarthy, trying to hunt down Soviet spies that might or might not be lurking in the United States. Meanwhile, the people in the Soviet Union were having a very different experience. They were just coming out of something called the 5-year plan. This was Stalin's effort to turn the Soviet Union from an agricultural country to an industrial one. And surprisingly, the communist efforts of doing this were resoundingly successful, creating one of the quickest industrialization processes in world history, and creating an economic force that could be reckoned with to this day. However, because it was accomplished under communism, it was all organized by one central authority and didn't have the say of the people involved in making decisions. So there were a lot of horrific things that happened in this process. Switching millions of farmers overnight to being industrial workers led to an extreme shortage of food, And so, millions upon millions of people would starve throughout the decade in the cold, snowy fields of Siberia. These cultural impacts, however, were not the only major impact that the Cold War had on the world. Because we still call it the Cold War for a reason, even though there wasn't a world war. This is because of the many proxy wars, which are small conflicts where the great powers indirectly fight each other through other people standing in for them. These would happen many times throughout the Cold War and would contribute to the overall theme of confrontation. Let's look at some examples. After World War II, the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied by Japan, was split into North and South, in the same way Europe was split between East and West as occupation zones, where the Soviet Union was responsible for taking care of the North, and the United States was responsible for taking care of the South. However, the Cold War tensions resulted in two Koreas that were very antagonistic towards each other. And in 1950, North Korea invaded the South, trying to conquer it. Continuing his doctrine of standing up to Soviet aggression, U.S. President Harry Truman decided to send in United States troops that were stationed in Japan to help South Korea. Although this was almost in vain, as the North Koreans almost invaded the entire country successfully, the United States, under United States General Douglas MacArthur, was able to push back and go all the way up even into North Korea, pushing back. However, this is when Soviet and Chinese forces became involved, as they did not want to see a communist ally be taken over by the United States. And so a stalemate ensued along the original border between the two countries, and this would last for another 2 years. In the Indian subcontinent, there are two major groups that have stood in long historical opposition to each other: the Hindus and the Muslims. In the center, the area outlined in red, is the area occupied by the country of India today, which is mostly Hindu. However, the two areas on the periphery, Pakistan in the west and Bangladesh in the east, are very Muslim areas. In the Cold War, there was a lot of tension between these two groups, as after the British left, there was a lot of confusion about whether there would be 1, 2, or 3 governments that would rule over the Indian subcontinent. Throughout the Cold War, there would be a series of Indo-Pakistani wars, which would be fought over who would control what specific areas, and even if those countries would have the right to be independent of each other. In these wars, the United States would mostly support Pakistan, as they had very close military ties with them due to their strategic location and resources. Meanwhile, India would be supported by the Soviet Union through both military and economic means. This is also seen in the after effects to this day, as throughout the War on Terror after 9/11, the United States relied heavily on military bases in Pakistan, and today, during the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's main economic partner that is resisting the sanctions the US is placing on Russia is India. In 1954, Egyptian General Nasser took over control of the government, along with gaining a lot of influence in Syria as well. Through economic aid and military hardware, he became a proxy of the Soviet government, accepting a lot of their aid and also conducting a lot of deals with them. This made the West very nervous because, as the black dotted line shows, the Suez Canal, which went right through Egypt, was vital to world shipping and trade, and Soviet communist control over this could have disastrous impacts for the United States, Western Europe, and their many allies across the world. To prevent a communist takeover of the Suez Canal, Israel, a country just to the east of Egypt that is allied with the United States, along with France and Britain, took a military intervention, invading parts of northern and eastern Egypt around the Suez Canal to take control of it. However, this was without consultation with the US, and the president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was greatly angered by this, as they did it without even communicating with him their intentions. In the end, he supported the Egyptian government and pushed Britain and France out through diplomatic means. This was surprising to many, as the military operations of the Europeans in Israel had resounding success and seized the most vital canal in the world. However, this was a signal of another of the great changes of the 1950s, decolonization. So, now we've talked about two of the major themes of the Cold War in the 1950s: the massive destructive potential of what a war could bring, the proxy wars that were fought as a result, and now that brings us to the third topic, decolonization. This is the time after World War II where the great European empires were torn to the ground due to total war, and they didn't have the ability anymore to manage international empires with colonies all over Africa and Asia. So, these countries began taking the opportunity to fight for their independence. Also, the superpowers of the Soviet Union and the United States, neither of which were big imperialist colonizers during the 1700s or 1800s, they were beginning to gain a lot of the international power, and as demonstrated in the Suez Crisis, the Europeans just did not have the power they did compared to the United States and the Soviet Union in that age. These massive changes would result in the creation of something called the Third World. This is a system of the world that many people use to describe the economic and political circumstances during the Cold War, with the First World being the countries in green that are democratic and capitalist. The Second World countries are the ones in red that are communist and totalitarian, and the Third World are the ones in yellow that are fighting for independence from the former imperial powers from Europe and that have recently ended their colonial status and are finding their way in through the new age as newly independent countries. These three topics that I've talked about are definitely the main forces that drove the Cold War in the 1950s. However, there are a couple other things to consider. One of which was the rise of the UN, the United Nations. This was the first decade where they really had a say in international politics. This was an international council of all the major countries around the world getting together to try to discuss through diplomacy what people used to decide through armed conflict. This had mixed results, as although it saw an increased level of international cooperation, it still couldn't prevent a lot of the proxy wars that happened across the world. Another major thing that happened was in the late 50s, the Soviet Union went through a process called de-Stalinization. After the death of Stalin, who had been the dictator of the Soviet Union for almost 30 years, the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, tried to make sure that the Soviet Union would go on a different path in the future. However, this would not mean freedom for the oppressed peoples under communism, just a different kind of tyranny. Also, the US launched many policies in order to strengthen its economic and military ties with the countries that had not yet fallen under communism. This includes the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact, the Marshall Plan of investment into NATO countries, and also the treaties that the United States made with Pakistan. However, in this time of increased international cooperation, better economic situations, and the threat of a world war possibly taken away, wasn't there ever an opportunity for the two countries to reconcile with each other and not be resigned to fighting a decades-long Cold War? While this might seem like a remote possibility, it really wasn't, because as it was said decades later, The United States and the Soviet Union didn't mistrust each other because they were armed. They were armed because they mistrusted each other. This is seen through the many spies that they sent back and forth between their countries. A lot of espionage was conducted against each other to try to find out the enemy's secrets and to get the upper hand in case a nuclear or major war did break out. And no event said this more than the trial of Gary Powers. In what many today call the U-2 incident, the United States CIA pilot Gary Powers was flying in a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union, taking photographs of their missiles for nuclear weapons when he was shot down and captured. Although the US tried to deny that this had ever happened, the Soviet Union came public with him as a prisoner, and eventually they conducted a secret prisoner exchange with a Soviet spy captured in Brooklyn in exchange for Gary Powers, who had been shot down. And so, the Cold War would move into the 60s, with two major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, opposed to each other, with no European empires to hold them in check, with more destructive capability that they had ever had in history, and with a new method of war, proxy wars, in which they could fight each other through indirect means that would not harm themselves as much it would harm the third world countries that they fought in. I hope you learned something new. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos about the Cold War and anything else about history. Thank you for watching.